Welcome to episode 5 of Las Weavers. This is a raw and divinely led podcast. And today's topic wasn't something that we planned on talking about. We were actually going to talk about dreaming big. And we found ourselves with a lot of cognitive dissonance about speaking on that topic while we're in the midst of colonial violence and genocide. And we wanted to create and hold sacred space. So today's episode is holding space in the midst of colonial violence. And really, this is a space to name things that we have been experiencing, name different things that we've been feeling collectively, and really to create a space to have a difficult dialogue that also influences the BIPOC community collectively, the Latinx community. And so welcome. This is also raw and divinely led because we don't edit. This is the way we record it is the way that you get it. So I'm going to introduce my co-host, la doctora Dulce Lopez, and I am Dr. Sandra Leon Villa. So welcome.
Thank you, Doctora Sandra. I want to really highlight this opening because as Doctora Sandra shared, we had envisioned and we had thought of a different plática to share. But she reached out to me and said, "Hey, Dulce, I don't feel right dreaming big when other humans, other people on the other side of the world are being attacked, being murdered." And I was like, wow, like it really impacted me because I'm going to be really honest here. I'm so nervous about this plática. I feel vulnerable. I feel impotent. And there's a small part of me that's like a little hopeless, unfortunately, right? That I feel like, ¿y yo qué puedo hacer hasta acá? ¿Cómo puedo ayudar? How can I help? But I chose to say yes to this dialogue because I really believe that this podcast is one in which we open up space for deep feelings, right? Things that are exciting, but also really scary and vulnerable. And when we open ourselves up to talking about things that we don't feel comfortable about or that we're a little scared about, I feel like that's where our healing takes place. And so I have to walk the walk, right? I can't just talk it. And so I had to push myself and say, hey, you know what? This is a really challenging discussion, pero si no lo hacemos aquí in this way, then ¿dónde? Right? So I just wanted to share that and start in that way.
And that reminds me, I shared yesterday something on my story, and it says, the portal to every next level is through the parts of yourself that you avoid. And, you named a lot of different things, impotence and helplessness, right? And this is something that is coming up. I believe in the BIPOC community, but especially the Latina community. I held a consultation, and as I do every single week, group supervision and consultation with staff and people that I supervise. And I felt really called to hold a similar space for them. And those are some of the things that really came up, right? It's the sense of powerlessness, hopelessness,
yes,
anger and rage, deep grief,
sorrow.
Yes, lots of sorrow and shame about not knowing enough, right? Shame about not speaking up on a topic because we don't feel educated enough to talk about it. And along with that shame comes fear. Like, we talked about fear earlier when we introduced the topic, but we're really living in a time where truth telling can really have an impact on your livelihood.
Truly.
You know, and so we were naming these things, and oftentimes we feel like, oh man, pues it's on the other side of the world,
Sí.
or we don't feel like we can empathize or connect with the issues of other people and what they're experiencing. And really, I wanted to have this plática because I want to emphasize that we don't need to know. Obviously, it's important that we educate ourselves, right? Like we need to educate ourselves about what's going on and what's been happening historically, right, with the Palestinian people and all of that. But also, we don't necessarily have to know all that information to know that genocide is wrong. That this is colonization happening against another group of indigenous people.
That's
That
right.
this is colonial settler violence, right? And we don't need to know. Pa eso no se estudia, like my mom says, right? Pa eso no se estudia. Like we can
Eso está
feel,
mal.
yes, and we can empathize with the grief, right? And we think that like these experiences are not like our own, but they really are. You know, in that group that I held on Wednesday, you know, colleagues and friends of mine and clinicians who are Salvadoreñas or Nicaraguenses, right? People who have parents that also grew up in the midst of civil war, civil wars that mostly negatively impacted the indigenous people from these countries, but also civil wars that were funded by our government, right? And so when we think that we can separate ourselves from what the people in Palestine and Israel are experiencing, we can't ignore the fact that our tias, our moms, our abuelas are also being triggered when they are seeing these images because of their own experiences with war-related trauma, with colonial settler violence that they've also experienced.
Y eso es lo que, y gracias por compartir, thank you for sharing, because it's that part of our story and history that keeps repeating itself. And we keep re-traumatizing ourselves, or we keep experiencing these mass killings, right?
And we keep being re-traumatized. Like we're not re-traumatizing ourselves, we're being re-traumatized.
That's right. That's right. And so when I think about experiences that happen here, and we can't even begin to heal from one thing cuando ya viene otra cosa. Here's another thing. And then there's no processing. But in this situation, it has been going on for a long, long, long time. Right. And you were sharing that you were in a plática yesterday. And I really appreciated the fact that you took time to educate yourself and to say, I need to be more informed. And so, I hope that you could share with us, what was it that called you to do it? What you can educate me with, and maybe we can share out with those that are listening. And I always, and the pláticas that we share, I often say, I want people to walk away with regalitos, right? I want them to walk away with gifts. And I think in this episode, it's really important for us to leave something that folks can pick up that can then lead them to opening up, or to giving, or to feeling like we could be part of the solution in some small way, to take a little bit of that impotence or that hopelessness, because we have to remember que sí tenemos poder. We really do.
And remembering that a tool of colonialism is also silencing.
Yeah.
Right? Remembering that neutrality is complicitness, right? And also that people are standing in solidarity in many different ways. right? Whether they're showing up on social media or not. And Dr. Tama talked about this on a live she did this morning, where like people may be educating their children, and that is disruption too.
Right.
Right. And so yesterday I was
I just want to highlight something that you just shared, please. I just want to share that the work that we do, no lo hacemos for show. We're not going to post something or we're not going to do something because, oh, I want people to know that I'm involved in. Like, how are we really living and walking the walk? That's what's important.
What is the embodiment, right?
Yes.
And I frequently talk about this as from a liberatory perspective, right? Like we need to embody being cursed disruptors, colonial disruptors. But I joined this plática yesterday because I, like many people, feel uninformed, right? I feel like we have only started to awaken to the truths of our own histories, right? And so it also becomes important to learn about other people's histories, other Black, Brown, and Indigenous people's histories, because there are so many parallels, right? Like there's so many parallels that we often don't think about. But, and so that was the goal of me joining this plática. But as soon as I joined, I noticed that they were running a few minutes late. And then the moderator came on and said, we can't, one of our speakers' houses just got bombed and they had to evacuate. The other presenter, they couldn't get a hold of her. And so it was just one speaker, Noura Erakat, who I believe is in the States here and is Palestinian. And so it was a really emotional thing to witness, right? Because we're expecting to learn from folks, but they're also in the midst of colonial violence and genocide. And so it was emotionally heavy, right? Energetically, it was really heavy. But I took a lot of notes about what she was talking about. And at one point she even made a comment like, I wasn't even supposed to be on here talking the whole time, right? Because it was supposed to be a group of 3 people, and people are still carrying a lot of grief and sorrow and not being able to mourn. And so one of the things that she talked about was just the historical context and how important historical context, just like historical context is important in our histories and in our historical remembrance, it's also important in everything that we are constantly exposed to, right? And part of higher consciousness is having this critical eye, this critical ear, right? To be able to discern the voice of oppressors, right? The voice of colonialism, really. And so one of the things that stood out to me, and as of today, more than 4,200 Palestinians have been murdered, right? Like, and that's in like what, 10, 11 days, which is crazy because the media will share the names of Jewish folks and people in Israel who are dying, but they're not sharing the names of the Palestinians who are dying by the thousands at this point. And so she said, what number of Palestinian civilians will suffice to horrify you?
Oh my gosh.
And then she added, and yet we are the ones who are called uncivilized. And isn't that the rhetoric? Isn't that the narrative that has been perpetuated for BIPOC communities?
That's right.
At the mouths of colonizers, right? And so they can't find names of the folks who've been killed. And she talked about the US's role in funding this genocide. And as I mentioned earlier, the US has also played a role in the funding of civil unrest in many of our Latin American countries. And so one of the things that stood out for me is that despite the rhetoric and all the things that the media is like portraying, like we need to be, and I talk about this all the time, like we have to be mindful of words and the words that are being used, right? And something that she said is that according to World like laws on war, right? Black and brown people are not categorized as civilians.
In this time and day, todavía.
And we see that in immigration law. We see that, in
The way
historically
that
laws that oppress Black and brown people here in the States and in other countries. And so it made me think about how we think, when the media talks about civilians, well, who are they really talking about then, right? Who are they really referring to when they say things like civilians? And it's important, I think, to know that this has been happening for a really long time. And the goal is to really displace Palestinian people from their homes, right? And again, we're seeing that same, I almost feel like there's a blueprint, like there's a framework, and it's like one colonizer passes it to the next, right? Like they all have the same framework. And so we're experiencing very, very similar things, but the first occupation of Gaza was in 1956, right? So this is something that people have been experiencing for a really long time.
Right.
And there's been I'm not an expert by any means on the history of Gaza and Palestinians, and I only was able to capture a little bit of information. But again, she talked about how the power of media, right, to silence folks. She said she did an interview with ABC and they didn't show her segment. Instead, they told her that she was too combative, as many Black and brown women have heard across our lifetimes when we tend to be assertive and be truth tellers, but also that she made the anchor look bad, right? And there's other media outlets who are also not, right? They're being very intentional and strategic about the words and the people that they're allowing to come on. And so I just think this is a time to do our work, to educate ourselves, but also we talk about the mirror all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we only talk about the mirror when we see our happiness or our great gifts, right? Like, how can we not see ourselves in the people who are suffering, right?
And also, I want to share in the people that are creating the suffering, because a lot of the things that we read and share is like, somos un reflejo, no? Like you just said, we're a mirror. So we're really being faced with all the sides of ourselves through this genocide that's taking place, through the wars that are ongoing, through the violence that we experience in our own neighborhoods, through the stories that we hear and that are shared. And so I really want to highlight that it's like, yes, you brought up a good point. Que nomás queremos el espejo of the good things of us, the bright, the light. We get it. Mm-hmm. But there's also that darkness that is a part of us individually, right? As I've read in many things, it's so within, so without. And why do we keep perpetuating genocide and war and violence? What's happening internally? What are we saying? What are we doing? How are we, what are we thinking about that we don't say out loud? Or how are we showing up in our lives? Mm-hmm. And so I think when we often talk about we have to heal the collective, like, we're not just saying that because it sounds cute. We're not just saying that because it's the right thing to say. We're saying that because everything that's happening outside of us is a reflection of what's happening within us.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And remembering that we too have been dehumanized, right? Yes. That we too have and continue to be oppressed. And a lot of the emotions that come up within us, not only are they part of that mirror, but they're also being triggered, right? We talk about in psychology how the body keeps the score.
Right.
Well, we have colonial wounds. We have these soul wounds that are being activated, right? Oh. Whether we know it or not, whether it's conscious or subconscious, right?
Yes.
And, I did a live with Dr. Manuel Samarripa, who is the NLPA president, and he mentioned that his wife, Jessica, talks about this gran despierta, right? This great awakening. And we are seeing this higher consciousness among BIPOC communities, right? We're starting to remember our lineages. We're starting to remember our ancestors and spiritual and indigenous practices. But that's also the reason why we are experiencing this grief, That's also the reason why we're experiencing this sorrow, because when we remember and we know, we can empathize.
Yes.
And we can understand how this is, we've experienced this before in our lineages.
And as you're sharing that, I think it's also a way to shut us down. To say, oh, stay in your place.
Silencing us.
Stay in your place. No digan mucho, no hagan mucho, quédense calladitas. Like, keep going the way you've been going, because the more we step into our light, the more darkness that's going to come out to bring us back into that fear and that impotence.
And we experienced that right before we came on today, right?
Completely.
I literally was like, I don't feel like it.
Nos sentemos desganadas, and my energy's low. I haven't, and I was saying for a while, oh, I'm just moving with the season. Like, it's in the fall. I want to slow down. I've been taking a break from social media, and it's very intentional. And then I wondered, wow, is it really my sadness? Is it really the suffering that's happening that I'm picking up on, and I it's too much?
And that's interesting that you say that, because as soon as you said, I'm scared, that to me was an indication we have to hop on.
Yes, that's right.
Because we cannot
let that fear stop us.
We cannot be silenced. And part of speaking up and being in solidarity in the midst of helplessness and hopelessness and powerlessness is just standing in solidarity. However,
that space.
Whatever that looks like, right? Whether that means educating your parents, educating your familia, your friends, whatever that means, whether it means just using a hashtag Free Palestine, whether it means talking to your children, like, we need to be in solidarity, because what we do has ripple effects, right? And I think we're witnessing a collapse, right? And I often think about how, again, going back to how powerful words are, like we're so used to calling ourselves minorities, right? Like minority groups. And I fucking hate that, because if we really saw ourselves as the global majority, then how come we're not leveraging our power?
That's right.
And I think that's what's happening now, right? So going back to the Gran Despierta, to the Great Awakening, to this higher consciousness, part of that grief and sorrow is also moving us towards resistance and no longer buying into the media. I mean, we witnessed our president fucking lie about seeing pictures of beheaded babies, and then it was redacted right away, right? And then, oh yeah, we're going to send humanitarian support, but then we're the only people who, for the 44th time, we've vetoed humanitarian support to Gaza, right? And we hear the media blaming Hamas, and one thing that the speaker stated is Hamas didn't even come to be until 1987, even though the first occupation of Gaza was in 1956 and again in 1967. And then in 1987, Hamas was formed. And she said something that really stood out to me. She said most of the men who make up Hamas are 17 to 35-year-olds.
Wow.
And they all grew up in traumatic wartime genocide type violence. Right? And so we're constantly like being redirected here, but that's not really the issue. The issue is forced occupation, forced assimilation, forced forced anything, violence.
And as you're talking, I just can't help but keep getting an image of Afghanistan and all the horrific things that have happened since the end of the US being there, and how, I mean, within days, Afghanistan just went back to what it was before the US was there. So it makes me sick to my stomach, because it's like, how many more times does this have to continue happening? Cuando va a haber el cambio. But if I hold on to that vision of the Great Awakening, then that's where I find a glimmer of hope. Because I have to hold on to a glimmer of hope, porque si no, me deshago, literally.
Yeah. You know, and she brought that up in the presentation yesterday, and she said 20 years ago, there was all the propaganda happening, right? And then US talking in the media about like Iraq having nuclear weapons and using that as an excuse to invade Iraq, right? And it immediately, my mind went to the recent talk by the Republicans in our government about, oh, the carteles in Mexico and all of this stuff, and we're going to invade, but really you just want our lithium. Right. And thinking about how the media will use propaganda
to make us believe.
Yes, to invade other places, right? But then we don't hear about things like Gaza led 2 years of peaceful marches. We don't hear about that. They don't talk about it because the media is very intentional about what they're going to say, what they're going to show.
Weaponizing.
Yes. And who controls the media? Who controls? And I was at the Beyonce concert, and there was this huge thing that she ran across the screen, and it said, "He who controls the media controls the mind." And she's absolutely right. He who controls the media controls the world.
Neta.
And so now we're in a place where even our government is saying some unbelievable shit. Like at this point, we don't even believe what they're saying.
Right. I mean, at many points for a long time.
Yes, but now it's just undeniable, you know? And so I think for me, it's important for us to just be watchful, to pray for discernment, to recognize when it's the colonizer speaking, to question, right? Like there's always two sides to a story. To question, like, who are the powers at be? Who is interested? Do some history. There's data out there because the media will even bring on scholars. The speaker talked about, you know, how they're bringing scholars to talk about how and when war crimes are permissible or okay against Palestinians. What? And people se la comen, right? Porque pues es un doctor, es un profesor, es whatever.
Sabe.
Yes. Pero hay doctores.
Bringing it back to humanity. Bringing it back to humanity.
Yes.
That's where I feel like we need to go back. Just like we're human beings. Just everybody just wants to live, have a decent life, grow old. Like we're not asking for that much.
Yeah, to be free.
To be free.
And you know, like who takes away basic resources to 2 million people? Water, power. Like who? Food? Where the fuck is humanity?
That's right.
So I think that we need to feel what we feel, drop into that, allow it to flow, but not allow it to silence us.
Or stay stuck in it. Allow it to flow and not stay stuck. Because in that feeling of impotence, of hopelessness, no podemos mover. We can't move that energy, and we can't move towards something that can create a ripple, as little as it seems. I think the fact that we're even having this conversation for me is huge. Like that part of me that would have been like, no, Sandra, yo no puedo. I don't know what to say. Tengo miedo. You know, I could have said no, but I chose to say yes in spite of my fear. And so when we talk about anything that we talk about on this podcast, it's really challenging, for me at least, it's challenging myself, my worldview. What am I doing? How am I showing up in all the parts of my life? And so I encourage us to challenge ourselves again, right?
Yes. And you know, it feels heavy, and obviously take care of yourself, right? No one is saying go expose yourself to traumatic content all day.
No,
but also find the commonality among our peoples because we're one people, right? Like find think about how your tias and your moms might be being triggered because of their own experiences with civil unrest and war. Think about how this is directly related to the Latinx community, how we were too colonized and displaced, right, from our land. So, there's no liberation if some of us are free and some of us aren't, right? Like it's
right. So we encourage you to do one thing, whatever feels good for you, or right, or an opening, just an opening, a conversation, or researching something, or taking a class like Sandra did, and having a conversation with somebody that's like, no, yo no sé ni de qué. Okay, pues hay que aprender juntos. Let's learn. And then, more than anything, I encourage us to find ways to hold on to hope in the midst of this deep, deep sorrow and pain. Because if we don't, then our light will turn off. And if our light turns off, then we're in trouble, because then how are we supposed to give and keep moving forward?
And resist the narratives, right? The narratives are always the same. There's always a white savior. There's always a dehumanized Black or brown or indigenous person, right? Like,
que necesita ayuda.
Yes, we need to be saved, right? And question those narratives, because chances are we've experienced those narratives in our own communities. And so when we think about the mirror, it's not just love and light.
That's right.
It's our brothers and siblings in Palestine and Israel who are in the midst of some political war that has nothing to do with liberation and everything to do with power and money and colonialism.
In all parts of the world.
Guatemala is experiencing struggles, right? There's so much going on, and I think about this all the time. Like, if we chase it to the root of the problem, it's always white supremacy and colonialism at the end. So I thank you for holding space with me today.
Thank you. It's an honor, and I hope those that are listening with us, that are connecting with us, that something from our plática sparks something in you. And I thank you, Doctora Sandra, for the space, porque yo no me hubiera aventado. Like, I'm going to be real, and I feel safe with you, and I trust you, and I thank you for allowing me to be so vulnerable and afraid. And I hope that we can continue this conversation, through this podcast in different ways, and just reminding us que este trabajo es de por vida.
Yes,
it really is.
Yes. And I'll share the link for the video. I believe it's Hayward Books, but I'll share the link so that y'all can watch the recording for the speaker. And there's other things going on too. So if as resources come up, I'll share them on my page on Instagram, and you'll see our handles here at the bottom for both of us sharing resources. So cuídense. I'm sending lots of love and comfort, and I am going to go back in my cobija today because that's what my body is asking me to do today. And I hope that you all listen to whatever it is that you need to.
Gracias. Thank you. Take good care.
Bye.